Hi, I'm Jennifer Coe, and this is Living the Classical Life.
Jennifer Coe, it's so wonderful to welcome you here to Living the Classical Life. We've been wanting to have you on for a very long time, so we're thrilled to welcome you here in New York.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So your story certainly is a very unusual one. You got an English degree at Oberlin.
Yes.
Where did that idea come from?
I think I kind of wanted to do it from the beginning, and I felt really lucky that I had great professors there, and I had people who supported that decision. And it was nice to take that time also, I think, to grow up as a human being, to be able to explore all the different things that I was curious about. And ultimately, I think what school is kind of essentially for is to teach you to teach yourself and to know how to teach yourself. So I really do credit Oberlin for a lot of the positive things in my life now.
But why English? Why literature? Where did that passion come from?
I always had that passion, and I realized I think I always enjoyed solitary things because I actually do enjoy practicing, and I enjoy reading, and I enjoy writing, and I realized like everything is a solitary activity. So I'm not sure. Maybe it's you know what I think it is. I think the beauty of, or the thing that I find so significant in art in general is that it has the capacity to change you, to fundamentally change you. So when you read, whether it's a novel and you identify with a character who has experiences completely different from your own, and you're able to go into their perspective and into their experience and their entire life. And I think that's essentially what we do as musicians too. I think that's what I enjoy as a listener when I go to concerts, being able to empathize and feel things that you don't normally access on a daily basis. And I think the part that I like as a performing musician is that I'm able to go into the lives of composers and the perspectives of composers, and you really live within, it's like they become part of your DNA. So you're really living in their world and their perspective. And I think there's something, at least for me, that I find incredibly compelling about that.
So which came first, your passion for literature or music?
I think they were both kind of there at the same time. I remember in school, when I was in grade school, I always got in trouble because I was just reading books instead of, I was always reading under my desk instead of like paying attention to class. And I was, so I was always getting in trouble for that. So I think that was probably always there. That was as early as grade school. And I did get detention for that a lot.
Really?
Yes, for reading.
And did you do more reading in detention then?
Yeah, which was great actually. And I was really fortunate when I started violin because my parents are not musicians. And in fact, my mom, they're both from Korea, and of course the Korean War, for them it was the Civil War, happened after the Second World War during the Japanese occupation. And so I think when they came to the States, they tried to offer me everything that they didn't have. And I think there's something about growing up in a society where you are other, or where you're a minority, because you realize from a very early point in your life that there are very different ways of living one's life, right? So, I grew up eating Korean food because my parents are Korean. And that was definitely not something that was necessarily done amongst my schoolmates. So, you know, when I was a really young child. So you learn very quickly, I think, that there are very different ways of living and experiencing life from an early age.
Was it important for you in forming your musical and artistic identity to try to identify with a certain country or culture? I also grew up with immigrant parents. I'm also from Illinois, you're from Glen Ellen, I'm from Urbana. And it was always a question for me. Other performers were able to benefit from the support of particular communities of their respective countries, whether it be a Polish community. I never had that. Was it important for you to identify with a country to have their support, for example?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you're from Champaign, right?
Yes.
So I grew up in Glen Ellen, which at the time when I was a kid was completely farmland, which I think Champaign is as well.
Indeed. We were just 1 block away from the farms.
Yeah, and I think I might have been one of the, my family was probably one of the only families of color in the area that I grew up, and that was very defining for me. I mean, I can look back at it and I can be I'm grateful in some ways because it gave me this gift of empathy for people that are on the outside. But certainly while I was going through it as a kid, it was not fun to have, you know, eggs cracked into my hair every morning on the bus. So I used to get beat up by other kids in my school all the time as well. So I think that, but in the end, I think that the experience makes you, now as an adult, I feel that what it taught me was empathy for people on the outside and empathy for people whose experiences you don't necessarily know and can't necessarily comprehend. And having also, you know, my mom was a refugee from North Korea as a child, so also growing up with that experience, you realize the reverberations through generations that happen.
Did you have an awareness of what she had gone through when you were a child growing up?
This is an interesting thing because I think at the time there was not very much literature that had been translated from Korean into English. And so the way that I came to an understanding of my parents and their experience, as well as how they continued to live, was through first and second generation Holocaust literature. Relationships to food. Because I think when you're a child and you're literally starving and begging for a handful of rice on the side of the road, that kind of experience of hunger is very different from, if I say I'm hungry, that's like first world hunger, you know, it's not true hunger, you know, I'm like, oh, I'm starving, and I'm not really starving. I've never experienced that degree of starvation, so. But I'm curious, so you didn't have that experience in Champaign?
No, it was a university town that I grew up in, so it didn't really feel
different.
As one-dimensional. It was an international community, and so we had a lot of friends from different backgrounds, but in any case, I always did feel like an outsider anyway. But I think part of that is included in the artistic growing up process.
Yes, I do know a lot of artists feel that way. Yeah, I don't know. For me, I think, you know, first of all, my first violin teacher was extraordinary, and she really guided my parents because they're not musicians. And, you know, they had started me in everything, like ballet and gymnastics, and I think I took an acting course, and I was really into swim team, but that's, again, a solitary pursuit, right? With like the reading and the writing and the practicing and things like that. So, but the things, I hated moving my body. Ice skating, they started me in. I hated like performing in front of people, like moving around. So it was really, music was really a solace for me, and being able to go into these different worlds of composers, whether I was listening and going to concerts, or as a kid, my parents would take me to the Lyric Opera and Chicago Symphony, or just records. I remembered I was like crazy about records, and different people would send me like sets of like symphonies and things like that. So that was really, I think that was a place of solace for me.
So you were performing from a very early age. And speaking of the Chicago Symphony, there's a video on YouTube of you performing at
Yes.
the age of 11 in Orchestra Hall in Chicago with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And you seemed so, you walked onto stage with such a calm determination. Was it in fact perhaps easier for you to perform at that age?
I think it's absolutely easier to perform when you're younger. I mean, at that point, it was just fun. I mean, first of all, playing with any orchestra was super fun. And then, you know, because to have all of that incredible sound, and instead of having a reduced part in a piano, instead of having, you know, an entire orchestra into a piano reduction, having a full orchestra was just amazing. And then having it be the Chicago Symphony, which is a great orchestra, was also incredible. So that experience in itself was you know, a wonderful, I just remember it as being a wonderful and very fun experience, actually. But now, you know, when I go back to the Chicago Symphony, it's still wonderful because some of the players I've known and have known me since I was literally 11 years old. Other players I went to school with, so it's still a wonderful experience, and of course they still, you know, they're a great orchestra. But you know, I feel a different kind of responsibility.
Was the stage a place of joy for you from the beginning?
I just didn't think about it so much. And even now, like that part of performing is like the tiniest part of the process. All of the work, the hard part comes before, right? The learning of the score, the physically, technically learning the notes, coming to a certain degree of comfort technically. And for me, it's just about getting to the point where like technique doesn't get in the way of what you're trying to say expressively. And so like the rehearsal process, whether it's with a pianist or whether it's with other musicians or an orchestra, that's the fun part, and the performing is just an extension of that because there's a lot of interplay. I often tell, you know, kids, because I work with, I go into public schools and I give these presentations to school kids that don't necessarily have music programs in their schools. And I always tell them that being a musician, 99% of being a musician is your ability to listen, and it's what you hear. And that's what we do on stage. I mean, it should be probably even like 0.01% of your brain is worried about what you're technically doing, and everything else is about listening and responding.
And what happens on stage if you start to feel nerves? What's the best way to calm them? Because I've had the experience of being calm before a performance, and then during the middle, something can creep
really?
up.
You know, even when I've had a terrible night, and it doesn't happen like, thank God it doesn't happen on a regular basis, but when I've had that, you know, I essentially feel like I want to jump off a bridge as soon as that performance is over. I feel like I'd rather kill myself than, like, it feels so unbearable when you feel like you haven't done a great job. It's really like torture. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that it's just part of a longer process. That sounded overly dramatic. It's not that I would literally jump off a bridge, but it's like it holds a lot of weight if you feel like you haven't done a good job, or at least for me.
Is that in the eyes of yourself or in the eyes of the others in the
Oh,
audience
no,
that
that's
you
just for
perceive?
myself.
So you're not thinking, for example, okay, I didn't play well, I bet I'll get a bad review.
No. That never plays a part. Because I've certainly had bad reviews, I've certainly had good reviews, you know, and everything in between. I think everybody does. But I think the important thing to focus on is, are you actually doing the work that you believe in. And if you are, then it's fine, even if people hate it, or if people love it. Either way, it doesn't affect what you're doing. I think the times that I had one time in the last, I'd say, 10 years where a bad review really stayed with me for about 6 months. And I remember talking to a couple of my colleagues, and
was it that there was something personal about it?
I think if it was something, in that particular review, I think if it was something tangible, like if they said she didn't play in tune, and then I listened to the recording and I played in tune, then that would have been fine. But I think it was the more amorphous thing, because I think in that particular review, they just said I had no soul. And I was like, how do I know that I have a soul? So there's nothing that you can actually, it's very intangible, right? I think that was the part that bothered me. And then I remember I spoke to to a friend, a composer friend, and she said she remembered one of her early reviews said that she had the soul of a dead bird.
Wow.
And she was like, yeah, I still remember that, and that was like 50 years ago. So I think there are just some things that kind of stay with you. And then finally you get to a point where you're like, well, obviously, I mean, I don't know if I have a soul, but at least I'm doing what I believe in. And I believe in the music that I'm playing, so.
Our generation has available to us all the greatest performances that were recorded just at the click of a button. How do you not go as a performer or as an audience member comparing in your mind what you've known from these great performances?
You can't. I mean, at least I can't look at it like that. I think that would be paralyzing to walk on stage and say, like, you have to be perfect. Not only because it's not possible to be perfect, but also, like, let's say we made the perfect performance, right? What do you do after that? Like, you would never be able to function after that, because it's like, it's just impossible to, at least for me, I could never walk on stage saying, I'm gonna be perfect. I think, I collect historical recordings.
So do I.
And for me, it's fascinating. Part of what's fascinating to me is seeing how performance tradition has just, is constantly transitioning and evolving. Part of it is that I think I just like hearing like the scratchy noise. It's like when you love a book, sometimes it's interesting to read secondary material on that book, but it doesn't mean that, I don't believe in I think in general, I don't believe in an ultimate performance in any case. Everything is about perspective, and we do that, right? Or in academia, people do that. I remembered an exercise in school that we did at Oberlin was that we analyzed James Joyce's The Dead through, I think it was like 10 different perspectives of literary criticism. And you realize that there's no correct way of reading James Joyce's The Dead. There's no correct one way of interpreting any work. It's just how you structure essentially your argument, or you could say your thesis, or you could say your interpretation. And I think it's the same way with making music.
A lot of my classical music friends, when they have their time off, they're done at the end of the day. They do not listen to classical music at the end of the day. They listen to anything but. What is it like for you?
My composer friends say that I'm really unusual because I'm obsessed with notation and orchestration, and so we'll actually get together. I'm doing this later with a composer friend, and we just go through scores for hours, just studying scores, and it's so fun. And I realize that makes me a complete and utter nerd. But that's what I love doing, and they love doing it too, so I figure it's okay.
Were you ever interested in composing, perhaps?
It's an interesting question, because some of my composer friends say that I should actually, compose or just try. But I kind of feel like other people are much better at that. And I don't know. And it's interesting. You had mentioned that, you had been trying to do a documentary on yourself and you were just more interested in what other people were thinking. And I think it's the same thing for me. Like, oftentimes, like in social situations, it's probably partly because I'm shy, but I'm like always much more interested in what other people have to say. And it's the same with composition, I think, because I know how my brain works, but I'm more interested in how other people's brains work and how they see the world. And, you know, I think that's just interesting.
This brings me to the question of what is the role of chance and accidents in success? For example, as we were saying, the idea of this show was not mine. It was our director, Peter Hobbs, who looked at some initial footage that we were putting together for my website, supposedly, and he decided that I was asking too many questions, so we made it into an interview show. But this has ended up becoming a thing, and it's become a major part of my life, and one which has enabled me to live into a passion for speaking with people and learning their story. Were there aspects of your career that arose that surprised you?
I think I'm really lucky. I mean, all the way from the beginning, from my first violin teacher who told my parents that she thought I had something special to say as a musician, and she found a new teacher for me, told me she had taught me everything that she could, and so she did all that research, and she drove me an hour away every single week for a year and practiced to the new teachers and practiced with me, you know, in between. You know, they often say that it takes 3 generations to make a musician: the first generation to pull themselves out of poverty, the second to educate themselves, and then the 3rd generation can be an artist or a musician. And you know, my mom, who started her life begging for food on the side of the road, came to the United States, worked as a nanny, and got her PhD. So what most people will do in 2 generations, she did in her own lifetime in order to allow me to then be a musician. At age 14, I remember Isaac Stern happened to, you know, make the effort and the time to listen to me, and told me to go and study with Jamie Laredo. And then Jamie jokes that I basically walked, because I decided to go to college first. I decided to go to Oberlin, but then I knew that I would study with Jamie after. If Felix Gallimere hadn't heard me at a concert artist guild competition and then told me to go to Marlborough, and you know, I would be that was so eye-opening. It was an eye-opening musical experience, and I learned so much from that. I learned so much from Jamie about not only musicianship and being a violinist, but how to live life, you know, and how to live life as a musician, how to be a wonderful human being, which he is. I'm still working on it, but you know, and the kind of generosity that they had. I remember Felix would teach me he wouldn't take any funds. You know, the same from Jamie. I still did a lot of coachings even after I left school. And all of these musicians have been incredibly generous. So I feel like I've been incredibly fortunate and lucky, because if it had not been for these people who made an effort to help me along the way, I would never be here. And I think also, I remember very specifically that I had all sorts of doubts about, I mean, it hadn't been done to be a musician in my family, and I remember, in fact, my parents said something to me like, why would you be a musician? Nobody needs musicians in a time of war. They need doctors. Go to medical school. And, you know, but I was lucky enough that I had people who believed in me before I ever believed in myself. Like, I was never the kind of person that thought, I'm going to be a soloist, I'm going to be a musician. It was just something that I loved, and it was something that I felt incredibly connected to. And probably as a consequence of that, I probably wanted to do it well when I was younger. but I also had such wonderful guidance throughout my life that I know that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for this community of musicians. I remember even at Curtis, I used to play for Ed Aldwell. Every week, like during his lunch hour, I would play Bach for him. And he didn't have to do that. He was teaching all day at Curtis, you know, and he would have 1 hour to like grab a sandwich, and he was generous enough to like use every single week to listen to me do Bach for him. And you know, and I'm not even listing all the musicians who have given of their time.
So I have a question that I see as quite important, and I think of it all the time. What is the artist's relation to the larger world? There's so much going on in the world.
You know, one of the musicians I admire the most is Bronislaw Huberman. As a violinist, first of all, just the imagination in his playing is astounding. But also, he saved the life of one of my teachers, Felix Gallimere, because Felix had been in the Vienna Philharmonic, and they were just handing over lists of names of Jewish musicians, and Bronislaw Huberman established what was then called the Palestine Orchestra, and basically it was a way for Jewish musicians to get out of Europe. And he also wrote a political letter accusing the classical music establishment for being responsible for the deaths of these musicians. And I admire him for that. I admire Toscanini for he literally got beaten up leaving Bayreuth and was like left on a border. I admire Pablo Casals. He stood up against fascism. So it's difficult to know how because the world is very complicated now, right? So there are so many different things that are happening all the time. But I do feel that we are humanists, essentially, as musicians. I think that what music can give us, what I believe music can give us and what the arts give us is this ability to empathize. If you're whether you're performing or whether you're an audience member, you know, music is giving us this opportunity and this space to feel something that we don't feel every day, and to go to a place, an emotional place, that we might not experience unless we were at that particular concert. And in that sense, I truly believe that art gives us the gift of empathy, and can give people this gift of empathy, because I think it's so easy. It's so much more simple to say, oh, I've worked hard, I deserve everything I have. Those people over there, they're not like me. They're other. It's okay. They're collateral damage when we go over and bomb. Like, they don't even say that they're human beings. They're just collateral damage is. So I think what music can do is actually, and not only music, I think literature does this, I think visual arts does this, I think theater does this as well. But it can bring you to a place where you can experience something other than just your own personal experience. And I think there's something beautiful in that. So in that sense, I do think that it's true that one's response can be to dedicate oneself even more fully to art, but I think, or to their art form. But I also believe that it's important to engage with specific social things. And I actually started a nonprofit called Arco Collaborative because I wanted to engage with larger social questions and create programs that actually engaged with different issues that are contemporary. For me, what's interesting about classical music is how is it actually a vital part of all of our lives? How is it a vital part of the communities we live in? How artistically are we, in our lifetime, contributing to the art form so that it will continue to live in the future, like way past like when we all die? How in my life can I contribute can I serve this art form so that it can continue to live what I imagine to be a healthy life, like way past when I die. So, yeah. But that also eliminates performance anxiety, because and that's what I liked about doing Einstein on the Beach, because you literally feel that you are the tiniest component of everything that's going on stage, right? Because with the amount of performers on Einstein on the Beach, like there are just that many people like behind stage, like running everything, and just as many people, you know, working on the lighting and blah, blah, blah. And I think for me, what's really interesting and gets rid of performance anxiety is the fact that I realize that I'm just like this tiny little speck on this, like not only historically, but also in the process. You know, it's started by the composer and it's just continued by me, but really it's finished by the listeners. So you're always just like a small part of that. And I think that does like get rid of anxiety. And you also realize that every performance is just a small speck on like a lifelong relationship and experience with music. And I think that, I don't know, at least for me, that makes it easier to perform. So.
Jennifer, thank you so much for being here, for giving your time and your stories, and we certainly look forward to following your performances. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Awesome. It was fun. Yes.